Thank you all so much for sharing where you're visiting from. I love to ask. We get visitors from all over, and today we have visitors from England. Very fun. Thank you guys for sharing so far. There are two things I like to address before I get into the program proper. But before I get there, I should introduce myself. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Fort Sumter. Now that we are inside the fort, I am Major Gabby. I work here. Each of us develop our own program to present to you guys. They're all about 10 minutes, but they're all different. That way, if you visit us more than once, we can give you a different experience. And with each of these programs, we try to provide something that's a little outside your standard Fort Sumter brochure. Has anyone here visited Fort Sumter before? Okay, a couple. That's a good number. All right. So, there are two things, as I said, that I like to address for everyone who has not visited before we get into the program. First thing, people often ask, what is this black structure? Perhaps you've already heard a little bit about it. If not, that's Battery Isaac UG. That's built in the 1890s, part of the Endicott era, seacoast defense. There are similar structures on Sullivan's Island and up and down the coasts, so its completion does coincide with the Spanish-American War. However, nothing ever happened, never needed really to be used. A battery is a lot of things, but most simply, it's a group of guns working together. So 1890s, when they built that, they buried everything around it to protect it. This side was excavated or dug out by the National Park Service in the 1950s. So all the way in the 1950s, this was still being used as an active fort through World War II, at which time they were looking out. They had anti-aircraft guns. They were monitoring the coast. 1947, the military donated this property to the National Park Service. Since 1948, we were Fort Sumter National Monument. Since March 11th, we are Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historical Park. So second thing I like to address, the original height of the fort. Certainly it was taller than this, right? If you were thinking that, you are correct. We are missing two whole stories. 2 stories. So when this fort was first completed, the walls would have been, well, it was never completed. I'll get into that in a minute. But when they first built this fort, the walls would have been about 55 feet high. And why I say it was never completed? When it was first occupied by Major Robert Anderson, he came over from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter after South Carolina's secession. It was only 90% finished. But the walls were there. So 55 feet, the original flagpole would have been somewhere in this general area, if you can imagine that as I get into the program. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, okay, program. So as I mentioned before, we do this, they're all different, that way we can give you a different experience. Today I'm going to tell a story of something that happened just outside these walls just 1 year and 1 month after the opening shots of the Civil War. But before we get there, so we are all on the same page about why this place is so special, the opening shots, right? Fort Sumter is regarded as where the American Civil War began. But that's not to say that the first shot or shots were fired from Fort Sumter. It's a common misconception. The very first shot was fired by Confederates at Fort Johnson on James Island, and that was a signal that exploded over Sumter. It signaled to other Confederate forces on James Island, Morris Island, and Sullivan's Island to open fire upon Sumter in the center. Roughly 2.5 hours later, Major Robert Anderson, in command here on behalf of the United States, fired back, and the Civil War began. Now, those first shots took place on April 12th of 1861. And what immediately followed was a 34-hour bombardment, at the end of which Anderson and his garrison, his soldiers, about 85 of them, surrendered this fort or evacuated it, effectively surrendering it to Confederate hands, who then held it until February of 1865. Now, I should tell you, in the first 34 hours of the Civil War, there were no human casualties on either side. No one died. A horse died on the Confederate side, but I don't know how. The first death of the Civil War was, however, here at Fort Sumter. Now, as Anderson lowered his U.S. flag, a flag we have on display in our museum today, as he lowered that flag over this fort, he intended to give a 100-gun salute ceremony to honor it. On the 47th round, one of those cannons backfired and killed Private Daniel Howe instantly. Total accident. Poor Daniel Howe. But beyond that, moving on with the story, though Anderson and his garrison left this fort in April of 1861, the Union did not forget about what happened here. Because before there was a Civil War, before there was a first shot, and before there was even a Confederacy, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, a decision made right here in Charleston. Now, they did that in response to Abraham Lincoln's election as President of the United States, and the big thing they said they did not like about his platform was that he wanted the new western states added to the Union to be free, not slave states. Now, at that time, there were roughly 4 million elderly men, women, and children living in bondage in the United States. South Carolina's population was about 57% enslaved. An economy built on cash crops, vast plantations, forced labor. So those men making that decision to secede knew that if these new states came in free, They'd have representatives up in Washington, D.C. They would create a majority, and somewhere down the road, abolish that institution. So, South Carolina, first state to secede, December 20th of 1860. Huge to the Civil War story, to the Fort Sumter story, but directly impacting the life of the man whose story I'm going to share with you today. Show of hands, at least our South Carolinians must. Who's heard of Robert Smalls? We got a lot of people. That's so exciting. So usually very few people raise their hand. Now it could be that nobody wants to raise their hand, but that's okay too. I had never heard of Robert Smalls before moving to South Carolina. Now Robert Smalls was born enslaved in Beaufort, South Carolina. At the age of 12, he was sent out to Charleston to be hired out, meaning that he would work many odd jobs, but all of his wages, all that money he earned, went back to Beaufort to his master. Now, at the time the war began, Smalls was working aboard a transport, a steamer ship called the Planter. Before the war, it mainly transported raw materials, supplies, and such throughout this harbor. But after the war began, it took on a new role. After Fort Sumter was left by Anderson and his garrison, the Confederates took over this harbor. They manned 5 whole forts. They controlled the port entirely, and they commissioned ships like and including the Planter to transport supplies and artillery between the now 5-manned Confederate forts therein. Now Smalls' title was wheelman. He was essentially the pilot, a known and skilled navigator, but an enslaved man and painfully aware of it. Now please remember, he was just 22 years old when all of this started. When the war began, he's working in this position. He has a wife, he has young children, and like anyone would, he wanted nothing more than their freedom. But he knew how dangerous trying to escape would be, and still in his position, he saw an opportunity. Now, I mentioned before that though Anderson left this fort, the Union did not forget. And just a small part of what I was alluding to was that during the war, the Union set up a blockade, a line of ships out beyond the harbor, aiming to prevent Confederate ships and allies from getting in and out with supplies and such. Now, most of the enslaved people of Charleston, perhaps they knew about the blockade, perhaps they didn't. Likely they knew very little. Smalls, in his position, was very much aware of the blockade and aware of the fact that the potential for freedom was sitting literally on the horizon in a line of ships. But he knew how dangerous it would be to try to get out there. And even still, with his wife Hannah, they began to devise a plan to commandeer the Planter and to take their family out of this harbor into freedom. Now he involved the other enslaved crewmen. Some of those guys dropped out immediately, terrified of even caught talking about such a thing. Some stayed on board, but something pretty big needed to fall into place for them to successfully commandeer the Planter. They needed to be alone with it. Now, by Confederate law, the officers were not meant to leave the ship alone with the enslaved crewmen. However, they did it pretty often. They'd go into town some nights. They'd be gone for several hours. They said because they trusted Smalls, the other crewmen, but moreover, they didn't believe they would try to escape, or that if they did, they'd be successful. Now, they were wrong. A year and 1 month, May of 1862, one such night after 3 o'clock in the morning, Smalls and those other crewmen head off from the southern wharf of Charleston. But they didn't go straight through the harbor. They backtracked quite a ways, adding to their risk of being caught. They did this to pick up Smalls' wife and young children, families and friends of those other men. About 17 people in total made their way through the Charleston harbor that night, going painfully slowly, not to arouse suspicion. If you're familiar with steamer ships, you know they're very big, they're very loud. There was no chance of hiding. All they could do was pretend that they were carrying out some regular mission. And so far, so good. But remember, there are 5 manned Confederate forts in this harbor at that time. But they knew their biggest threat by far was right here at Fort Sumter. Now, this fort is impressive in its own right today. However, if you can see it, the red line on our flagpole gives you an idea of how tall this fort was all the way around in May of 1862. Throughout the war, there were hundreds of Confederates here, guns with them, and they were watching. But Smalls has thought all of this through. So as he approaches the fort, he has a few things working to his advantage. First, because of the nature of the Planter, he has a code book from the Confederacy and knows what signals to use for safe passage. Second, he's been watching the captain of the Planter and knows how to imitate. He knows the captain usually wears a wide-brimmed straw hat, so he put that hat on. He knows that he crosses his arms, so he does so. He signaled those signals, and if you can believe it, Robert Smalls exchanged words with the Confederate at Fort Sumter. No suspicion. Meanwhile, the other enslaved crewmen, the families, some of them were weeping because they were so afraid of being caught. Men would have been killed, families separated. But they weren't. They passed Fort Sumter, then Moultrie. Out of range of their cannons, they sped up. They head right for the Union line, and you would think that the hard part is over, but Smalls knew it was not, because now they're heading right for the Union line in this big, loud ship flying a South Carolina flag and a Confederate flag. And the Union commander has no way of knowing what's going on. So he's preparing to open fire. But they have gone way too far to turn back and face the consequences. So having thought this through, if you were them, what would you do? Well, first, lower the flags as fast as you possibly can. But then, having thought this through, they raised a white bed sheet that his wife had brought with them to signal surrender, to signal something like, hey, don't shoot, we're on your side. Now, at the last moment, the commander saw that flag, that symbol did not open fire, and Smalls was able to approach. And I mentioned earlier that there were other nights when they could have executed this plan, other opportunities. This night was not randomly chosen. Smalls maximized the situation. He waited until the Confederacy had loaded the planter down with supplies and artillery, including a gun originally intended by the U.S.'s military for Fort Sumter. So when he approached the Union commander, the first thing he said was something to the effect of, "I have something that belongs to you, and I have some information that you can use." Now remember, he has that code book he's been transporting for the Confederacy, has an idea of what's moving around this harbor, where some of those mines are laid, and he is a skilled navigator of these challenging waterways that we still deal with. So all of those people gained their freedom right there, but the story did not end quite yet. Now during the Civil War, Smalls traveled the nation, giving speeches, meeting with Lincoln and other figures, encouraging a massive turnout of enlistment, specifically among black men, including formerly enslaved men like himself, for the United States, for the U.S. in the Civil War. He came back as pilot of the Planter, and then as pilot of one of the ironclad ships that attacked Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor. Now, even with the war's end, his story continued. Using the money he earned from surrendering the Planter, he went back to Beaufort, bought the house he was born enslaved at. His family lived there for the next 90 or so years. Smalls lived until 1915, a public servant holding titles such as South Carolina State Senator and U.S. Congressman. And among many accomplishments in his life, he was instrumental in establishing South Carolina public schools. I'd never heard of this person. Now, in his life, moving forward, just from Reconstruction going on, he continued to face discrimination, hardships, of course, but he continued to use his influence, his notoriety, his courage to advocate for himself and his family, and remember the millions of individuals who gained freedom from bondage following the Civil War, from contributions from people like Smalls, like his wife Hannah, who did something so incredibly dangerous in May of 1862. And so today, very briefly, I wanted to share a story with you of someone who is not just a contemporary Union Northern hero, but someone who continues to be an American hero, who lived and breathed in that city and whose incredible escape to freedom took place just outside these walls 1 year, 1 month after the opening shots of the war. And I've gone a little bit over, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. If you have any questions for Sumter, let us know.